Silver Apples started when? 1960?
67 as a band. We recorded our first album in 68, second one in 69. We recorded a third one in 70. It was never released. The record company went belly up, and the financial situation got bleak, and the band sort of disbanded out of financial weight.
Mm-hmm.
And Danny was the drummer. We were a duo at the time, Danny Taylor and I, and we just sort of went our separate ways. And I had been a painter before Silver Apples, and I just went back to painting. And I don't know what Danny did. I've lost track of him. But I didn't stay with music. I sort of disappeared from the music scene for about 20 years.
Right. And what brought you back?
I was at an art opening.
Uh-huh.
Some of my work was being shown in a large show in Brooklyn. There were about 100 artists that were showing in this show. It was the Crest Hardware Show. It's an annual event over there.
Mm-hmm.
And several bands always play for it. And one of the bands that was playing in last year's event was an all-female band called Ultra Vulva. And Christian was friends with a couple of them, and he was doing their sound for them just as a favor. And I thought I recognized the lead singer in the band, and I went over to her and I was saying, did you ever play at Max's, or do you ever wait on tables there or something? I kind of thought maybe I knew her, and she said, well, yeah, I was. And I said, well, did you know a band called Silver Apples? And she said, no, I never heard of them. She walked away, and Christian was standing right behind her, and he overheard it. And when she walked away, there was Christian looking at me saying, Silver Apples? You were Silver Apples? And I said, yeah. And so we started talking and became friends, and later bandmates. Yeah, I was singing lead in a regular 5-piece rock band, just playing clubs in the village and stuff. And you work every night, 3 or 4 sets a night. It gets old, and I started looking for stuff to do. And I had a friend who used to get drunk. He'd drink bottles of vodka and smoke weed and play these oscillators against Beethoven records. And it looked like roaring good fun, and so I asked him if I could borrow it. And so I borrowed it and plugged it into an amp on stage one night, and when they were in one of their standard blues jams that just went on forever, I started swooping up and down the dial with this oscillator, having gleeful fun. And that's kind of how it all got started. They quit because they were so pissed off that I had ruined their blues jam with all these sounds. And the drummer and I are sitting there staring at each other saying, this was pretty interesting stuff. Why don't we try something? And so we started writing songs around just the idea of drums and all these oscillators.
Right. Had you heard any other bands at that time who had used odd instrumentation like 13th Floor Elevators with Electric Jug, or Lothar and the Hand People?
Lothar and the Hand People I'd heard of. I had heard they used a theremin.
Right.
They were basically a guitar band, but they had a theremin thrown in the mix. I was not really aware of that. I was aware of Stockhausen and that kind of approach to electronic music, and having a rock sort of music background myself, I just sort of put those two together. It was more like a pure electronic experimental rock thing, experimental music thing that I threw into the rock mix.
Right. And the name Silver Apples, did that come from the Morton Subotnick album of Silver Apples of the Moon?
That came from a poem by William Butler Yeats called The Song of the Wandering Angus.
Okay.
And it's the line, golden apples of the sun, silver apples of the moon, has been used by lots of bands from Laika to Subotnick to Judy Collins. I mean, it's been used a lot. It's one of the very popular poems. As a matter of fact, on the Judy Collins record, Silver Apples of the Moon, the whole poem is done. She does every line in the whole poem, so. It's a great poem. It's about a bull that wanders fields in Scotland looking for some pure aesthetic. And I think he ends up getting laid, which is...
what bulls do.
Yeah.
I heard that you lost the original Simeon underneath somebody's porch.
Yeah, well, but, it was just made up of World War II vintage oscillators, the old tube oscillators that I had found in junk shops and stuff. And so when I put the band back together again last year, I just went around and found more oscillators. I mean, you can find them. They're not as common as they were, and they're getting rarer and rarer. They stopped building them 40 or 50 years ago. So they're harder to find now, but they're still out there.
How does your experience playing oscillators compare to, are you playing keyboards now?
I have keyboards that are there simply because they're easier
Mm-hmm.
than, see, the way I did it before, not being a keyboard player, I routed all these oscillators through telegraph keys.
Right.
And then I color-coded them with pieces of colored tape so that after tuning them, you'd know that all the ones that were blue would be like in one kind of chord structure, and all the one key.
Right.
And all the ones that were red would be in another. And so, like, whirlybirds would be in the key of red, and oscillations would be in the key of blue. That's kind of how we referred to how we were playing. Danny tuned his drums, and he put tape on the drums, so you knew that tom-toms that were certain colors would go with certain songs.
Mm-hmm.
Now what I do is I go to the office supply stores and I buy those little colored dots that you can stick on, and I put those on my keyboards. And that way I know which notes. All the blue notes sound pretty good with oscillations, and all the green notes sound pretty good with some other song, Fractal Flow or something. I still play the same way, in other words.
What kind of keyboards are you using?
I'm using some Junos. I have a Juno 1 and a Juno 106.
And do you find any difference in the sound that the oscillators produce as compared to the sound that you find that's coming out of? We shouldn't name the
generic keyboard I play.
Yes, right.
It's the keyboard has 6 digital oscillators in it.
Right.
You can then tweak the keyboard to get more or less a tube sound.
Mm-hmm.
It's not exactly there, but when you're playing at 900 decibels, who knows? It's probably something that you'd be able to tell the difference if you were recording, but in there you'd have even more control. So, essentially it's the same sound. To me, the band sounds the same, or even maybe a little richer, because there's more going on. Than it sounds the same as it did when Danny and I played. Even though the oscillators look a little different, they run through keyboards and whatnot.
Right.
It has that sound. We are Silver Apples, no question.
And when was the first Silver Apples gig? Was that at the Knitting Factory, or?
The sort of reintroduction of Silver Apples was as a quartet at the Knitting Factory, and we had every intention of continuing as a quartet. But Arrow decided that he would like to pursue some serious solo projects and things and tour the country in a wheelbarrow. So we said, all right, good luck, my friend, and we bought some bass equipment and wired it in with MIDIs and, made it so that we could replace him without bringing in another person.
And it kind of works better as a trio, really.
It does. I like working as a trio. I think the music is tighter. There's one less element to have to deal with.
Right.
One less mind to have to explore. The machine's mind is very intricate, and it makes you crazy to look at them too long. You have to go get drunk,
and then you have to
and then
punch
come
them.
back, and then whack them with sticks.
Did you find that the oscillators were simple? Was that easier for you to play?
It's the
to play
most
those?
complicated thing in the whole world to play. Imagine
Really?
trying to pick up a violin that has one string that goes from so low that you can't hear it to so high that you're driving dogs into squirrel holes with it.
And you were playing how many of those?
I played 2 of them. I usually play a lot. I mean, there are like 6 into each keyboard. Plus there are 2 that are freestanding, sitting right in front of me, that have the swoop dials on them. And you have to play them like you had an endless tone trombone or violin or anything that doesn't have frets or doesn't have valves that give you exact notes when you put your finger down on it and stroke it. You have to listen probably more carefully than a violinist would, because a violinist can at least vibrato his way into the note if he hits some really sour, nasty one. With an oscillator, you're there for all the world to see. So, the
and
easy
it was just
way.
you playing melody too.
Try and play melody.
Yeah.
There's several songs where that one oscillator I attempt to play the melody, and lots of times if it gets off, I just pretend I meant dissonances. Stockhausen got away with it, so can I.
Right. I read one review. I forget who the author was, but it was in Billboard in I think 68, and he was mentioning that you were making jungle noises and so on.
Yeah. They didn't know what to say about us in
Right.
1968.
What did they say?
They said whatever Cap Records paid them to say.
Uh-huh.
It was that type of a trip. Today's reviewers seem to be much more independent from the labels, and you can kind of believe, I think, a lot more of what you read today. Back then, it was like total control.
And how did you end up on Cap Records? That was an unusual band for
Yeah,
them.
they had a bunch of like gospel acts and some
Eartha
piano
Kitt,
lounge,
I think, or-
and some
yeah.
lounge piano guy, and Roger Williams or something. Yeah, we were the odd egg. We were the ugly duck, black sheep. All of those. The reason was they were a failing, like giant star. They were going supernova. They thought that if they brought in something that was really crazy, they would get people's attention. They could maybe turn the label around.
Right.
And so they went searching for something in the rock idiom that might possibly be that thing that would hit, make them lucky, make them turn it around. It didn't happen, but they signed us because they thought we were certainly the freakiest act in New York, maybe the freakiest act in the country, and had the possibility maybe of doing it. So they signed us to a 2-record contract. They put a lot into the first album. We toured off of it and all that, and we made that. We rode the Billboard Top 100 for about 10 weeks. It sold a lot of records, but it wasn't enough to save the whole company, and they eventually just folded. And we never saw a nickel. They reneged on all royalties and artist royalties and everything.
What kind of reactions did you have from crowds that you played?
It was mixed. Generally, on the 2 coasts, it was enthusiastic, jumping up and down, almost slamming around kind of reaction. In the Midwest, it was people lying on the floor, taking God knows what, and trying to find that ethereal space that we were creating for them. And everywhere else, it was like just blank stares. Didn't know what to make of it. But there were those, it's odd, the Midwest, I'm talking like Cincinnati, Cleveland, Minneapolis, that area in there, they got into the real trippy aspect of it. And places where you would think it would be real trippy, like San Francisco, they were into the slamming around. It was really crazy. And in New York, people just went nuts every time we played. They loved us there. We sort of still think of New York as our home base. That's where our sort of like core fan base is.
And what clubs did you play in New York? You played Cafe El Go-Go, or?
We were there, yeah. We played there. We played the Village Gate, Cafe Wah, Max's Kansas City.
Right. Is it true that I thought I'd read that you were the first band to play at Max's Kansas City?
We were the first one. We were the only one for a year and a half. He wouldn't allow anybody else in there.
So you had a steady gig there?
We had a steady gig every Monday and I think Wednesday night. Starting at midnight, we played from midnight to 4.
And so that was what years did you play there?
That would be part of 68 and most of 69, like that.
So did you hang out with the Max's Kansas City scene?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have one of the vinyls around here, but there's a portrait done by Andy Warhol of me on the cover of that vinyl.
No, unfortunately we don't.
Well, we should have brought you one. There is a vinyl that was released in December by Enraptured Records of London. That's got Fractal Flow on the A side and a remake of Love Fingers on the B side.
Right.
And the double portrait that Andy did of me is like a fold-out thing in the vinyl, on the sleeve.